Hey, Schoolbus here. Today, in our tank chat session, I want to propose a question. Do you think it would be possible to develop an algorithm that could approximate the combat effectiveness of light tanks in World of Tanks? And if we were to make that algorithm, would premium light tanks release prior to the light tank apocalypse? In other words, they stayed at tier 6, for example, when their counterparts that were non-premium got moved up to tier 7. Would those premium light tanks show as being OP for their tier? We're going to take a look at that in today's video. A very valid question you might be asking is, why do this? I can go out to VBA Addict. I can look at the data. I can see per battle on each tank how much damage was done. Isn't that giving me the combat effectiveness? And I think by and large that is true. And you will see I have drawn correlation to that statistic to kind of sanity check my numbers. However, I would argue that you're not seeing the full picture of the true combat effectiveness of the tank, not to be confused with the combat effectiveness of the tank and its commander working together in concert, the commander being the player of the game. Some tanks are going to be biased. If you have a tank that's only available to certain elite players, or it tends to only be purchased by elite players, well, that's going to be a bit of a biased result and it's going to tend to run high. Conversely, if you have a tank that tends to find itself in the hands of a disproportionately large number of not so good players, that could bias the tank in that direction. And we'll see a few examples of that as we go through and we look at the data. So as Quickie Baby would say, that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's go look at the results. All right, so here we have the spreadsheet where all of this has been assembled. And I could spend a whole lot of time talking through this in a lot of detail, but I don't want to do that, at least not for this initial, what we could call a preliminary look at these results. I know there are still adjustments to be made, particularly when it comes to derp guns that are firing HE. We'll see later they may be nerfed a little bit in my numbers. So there's always work to do. But what I want to talk about specifically are the factors that are being applied so you can have kind of an idea of what I deem to be the important aspects of the combat effectiveness of light tank. So first off, we have a DPM factor. And actually, though I played with this, I ultimately set it back to 1. It truly isn't having any impact right now. Then we have a factor on derp, basically saying that of the total alpha that's available, on average, only 70% of it is actually carrying through into the numbers. You don't always get full penetration shots. There's also a factor for dispersion. So looking at the total sum of the hard and soft stats for a gun, what's its base accuracy, and then what are the soft stats when you're traversing the hull, traversing the turret, and whether it be raising and lowering the gun at the same time. It adds up all of those factors and applies an adjustment to the combat effectiveness based on that. Then there's the burst factor. And the idea with the burst factor is you have, particularly with autoloaders and to some extent with derp guns, the ability to quickly flank an enemy, do a lot of damage, and get out of there. And this is basically a value that looks at in 10 seconds how much damage can be done by a particular tank. And it's definitely something that affects the autoloaders and the derp cannons more so than the single shot. So it's giving an advantage to those types of tanks. Then we have a shell velocity factor. This is evaluating to a slight degree, applying a factor, as you can see by the 0.1 associated with it. If a shell travels faster, it's more likely that it's going to hit, and thus you'll have a higher realized damage output. Similarly, shell penetration factor. What's the point of a shell being fired if it doesn't actually penetrate and do any damage? And then last, again, this doesn't really apply to our discussion today. This would be a conversion factor required to apply these numbers into 4tankers' existing scout power rankings. This adjusts the combat rating such that it, I think it works out to about a third of the a third of the value of a light tank's ability is applied to the combat ability versus its vision and camouflage. So I should note, I did reach out to Four Tankers and Dog because I needed to confirm with him it was okay to do this rather derivative work of his previous work on the Scout Power Rankings. And B, I wanted to get his thoughts on what he had potentially previously uncovered as he looked at doing the Scout Power Rankings. He obviously would have thought at one point about the combat effectiveness. I was curious if he had any thoughts. So here we have the stats overall. And this is all tanks that were evaluated, sorted in descending order of their combat rating. Do note that in the chart on the right, the combat ratings have been, and actually even the one on the left, they have been multiplied by a factor of 10. And that was just to generally bring them into an order of magnitude that was similar to the VBA stat damage. So more quickly, I could mentally jump between the numbers and keep track of what I was seeing. So you can generally see here with the color coding of Tier 6 being blue, Tier 7 being orange, Tier 8 is red, Tier 9 is blue, and Tier 10 is green. You can see that there is intermixing between the tiers, indicating that just because a tank is at Tier 10 doesn't mean that potentially a Tier 9 tank doesn't have a higher combat rating. Though in general, you can see that the tiers do tend to cluster together. But now let's go through and look at each of the tiers individually. So first here we have Tier 10, and need to explain a little bit the chart here on the right. We have plotted across the x-axis the damage as logged by VBA Addict, and then we have on the vertical axis our combat rating multiplied by a factor of 10, just to kind of get the numbers similar on both axes. And the first thing that strikes me here is the fact that we do have the Sheridan with the 152 so low on the list. And I think what it's a case of is once I got other factors in line, it has left the derp tanks in the dust. And so that will be something I will be working on for iteration 2 of the algorithm, is to better account for the derp tanks. They're getting penalized by that factor, if you recall, on dispersion, as well as some of their damage being taken away because of firing HE. But otherwise, this makes pretty good sense to me. We have the AMX 13105 near the top. The Sheridan with the 105 is actually a little bit stronger, and it should be noted that the Sheridan with the 105 and the Sheridan with the 152 in VBA Addict, that's being combined into a single tank. It's not being logged as two separate tanks, in which case you would see the Sheridan with the 105 moving up and the Sheridan with the 152 moving down in terms of its VBA Addict damage. I also want to give a special shout out to my 2-year-old son for helping drive home my point earlier that yes, the numbers make sense. Now jumping to Tier 9, we see a much tighter distribution, save the T-49 with its 152mm gun. The 1390 is topping out the list, edging out the T-49, and it's by a pretty good margin considering the fact that when we jump up to Tier 10, their respective tanks actually, we see them nearly equal. There really isn't much else to say about Tier 9. It's there aren't many tanks there to talk about, and they are nicely following the trend line, with maybe the lightweight T-54 being a little bit weaker in terms of its score compared to its other regular single shot counterparts. Tier 8 was a lot of what drove my reapproaches to the algorithm, because initially it was very scattered. It was difficult to draw a good line through Tier 8. And I think part of that is because this is where we're first seeing the introduction of the premium tanks. And also we have the ELC Even 90. And despite my best efforts to make adjustments to the algorithm to better account for the merits of the Even 90, it still bottoms out the chart at a combat rating of 877, with the LTTB being second from last at 971. But we can see the even 90 is in third place when it comes to its VBA addict results. And I attribute this to the fact that the even 90 has incredibly small size and great maneuverability, and it's likely that its extreme stealth and evasion ability allow it to live longer and deal damage more than its subpar gun statistics would indicate. It's also possible that the even 90 tends to fall into the hands of above average players than some of these other tanks on the list. There's nothing about its stats that just screamed, ooh, if I buy this tank, it's going to make me a great player. I think it tended to appeal more to those who were adept with that style of tank and resulting gameplay. This is the first time that we're seeing the prevalence of premium tanks, and I think the initially proposed hypothesis of there being some merit to the fact that pre-light tank apocalypse light tanks are going to have a distinct advantage in terms of their combat ability. I think we're seeing that here with the Black Dog at the top of the list. We can see a post light tank apocalypse even 90 not being particularly OP in terms of its stats. And the Batchat 12T is fairly even with the even 90, no pun intended. And then we have the Wheezy 132 as a fairly strong player in the single shot tank category, kind of right along the average if we were to draw a line through here, ignoring the ELC even 90. With tier 7, we have a good distribution, no major flyers here. We have the AMX 1357 coming in with the highest VBA addict stat damage, but it is bested by the T71DA in terms of its combat effectiveness score. And I attribute this to the level of skill that the average 1357 player has. I have a 3200 win 8 on the 1357. Specifically, I have the 137 GF. Note that VBA Addict is lumping both the regular 1357 premium tank and the 1357 GF premium tank as a single entry. I have a 3200 win 8, and I have not made it much past one gun mark, despite having played over 600 battles in the tank. It's also worth noting that the 1375 is a good indication of the fact that higher numbers don't necessarily mean a better tank. It is, I sometimes am dyslexic, and I will look at 1375 and 1357 and be like, wait a minute, what's going on there? I'm seeing the same number twice. But no, you're seeing it right. The 1375 is much lower on the both VBA addict damage and the combat rating. And finally, this brings us to tier 6, the tightest distribution of them all, with Type 64, no surprise, being at the top of the list, as it is a premium tank prior to Light Tank Apocalypse, and it's even a solid tank tier for tier back before Light Tank Apocalypse. I haven't played the 12T since the changes to the light tanks, but it doesn't surprise me that from a statistics standpoint it ends up a little bit low, and it does call into question the possibility that since the light tank changes were made a little over a year ago, it's possible that because the stats weren't reset, obviously, there may still be some bias here from the previous stats, particularly for tanks that were changed drastically before and after. I think the 12T used to be a stronger contender for its tier than what it is now. I can vouch for the fact that the MT25 does feel rather weak at tier 6. That was certainly my experience with it, although it pales in comparison to the atrocity that is the LTTB that I just cannot at tier 8 enjoy that light tank. It's been a bit of a challenge for me. It's not the worst tank I've played in the game, don't get me wrong, but I definitely don't enjoy it compared to, say, the Batchat 12T. So there you have it. What are your thoughts? Do these numbers surprise you? Did you expect certain tanks to show up differently? It's taken me a long time to pull this together. I've done many readjustments to the math behind it, trying to get things fitting together the way that makes sense, both in terms of what we see in VBA Addict and just in general trying to account for the various characteristics, both the hard and soft stats of the guns, to be able to develop what I think is a worthwhile algorithm. Again, I reiterate that I reached out to 4Tankers for input leading up to this and wanted his blessing on my derivative work, as well as input regarding his thoughts on the path that I took. So if you've made it this far in the video, kudos. I give you my golf clap applause that this has been a lot of information. I do look forward to seeing your feedback, both positive and negative. But do remember, this is version 1.0. I'm sure there will be updates to it, but constructive feedback will be helpful. The main thing, as I've already pointed out, is that I want to work more on the 152 millimeter derp cannons. I think they should be higher on the list, and I need to find a mathematically driven reason to do that. Now for some bonus content if you would like to know more. So a possible prerequisite to this video is that you really should go check out 4Tankers and Dog's video on his Scout Power Rankings. And I think that was probably, it's been a year ago that he released those. And I could never shake the feeling that as I looked at some of those tanks, that some of them, although not great pure Scout tanks, tended to have a lot of merits in their combat effectiveness. And specifically, the autoloaders came to mind. That when I looked at tier 10, it seems like the AMX 13105 would potentially have some merit to its combat effectiveness that would outweigh some of its pure scout weaknesses. And in many battles, I think there are times when a light tank is in that unique position, combining its speed and its stealth, that it can quickly exploit an enemy tank that is possibly in a vulnerable position to flanking. The light tank can move in, flank, kill that target, and be out of harm's way in a matter of 10 seconds. And having removed that enemy asset has now raised the chances considerably for their team to win on a particular flank.